Again, we'll wait just a second for the sound to kick on. Should be good by now, though. So today is Tuesday, 5/12, and you're watching the video lecture and taking notes on the animals note section 8-4. Obviously, the link will be sent later because I'm making the link right now. Now, remember, in all honesty, like most likely, I'm kind of doing this video a little bit in advance. You guys will probably be able to kind of, if you don't want to necessarily watch all of this video on this day, you guys can kind of split it up a little bit. That's okay. Because tomorrow, ultimately, your quiz is on the notes 8-3 on plants. I just wanted to use today to get a jump on moving ahead into the animals. So kind of tomorrow/Wednesday, you guys can look at finishing those notes up, okay, or watching this video. So like if you find a natural point, you always want to stop and come back to it later, that's fine. Because I know that this one's going to be a little longer, again, not ridiculous, but again, a little bit longer. So that's fine. So let's go ahead and get into things today and talking animals today. So again, this is of which the what we belong to, right? To kind of put some perspective on kind of where we're at with things. We've looked at the three domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. The kingdoms, right? Bacteria and archaea together. These are all the prokaryotes, right? And then we have the eukaryotes over here. We've talked protists, we've talked fungi or fungus, we've talked plants, and now we're into the animals, right? So they are eukaryotic cells. They have a cell, nuclear membrane. The big dividing feature when you start to compare plants to animal cells, obviously, is that animal cells have no cell walls, exclusively multicellular, and animals are exclusively heterotrophic, meaning, again, they are not photosynthetic. They have to seek out and find food. Okay, so we're in this section, but I think this is a nice image to kind of look at, where we came from, right, thus far, and kind of where we're going to in this last little section. Okay, so animal characteristics: animals are, like we said, eukaryotic. They lack cell walls, unlike kind of what we've seen in other groups that we've looked at. They are all multicellular, and they are all heterotrophic. So what we just kind of looked at on this image here, okay? And again, this is the PowerPoint presentation for section 8-4 that you guys have received, okay? All right, so animal evolution, right? Animals evolved about 700 million years ago, okay? So relatively recent, to be honest with you. Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. They evolved from colonial protists. So not unlike, when we looked at the protists, and remember that thing called Volvox, right? That we looked at how it was moving around. It's kind of that funky sphere of cells. It's a colonial group of cells. So not really truly multicellular, but these colonial clumps of cells eventually become specialized enough to ultimately turn into specialized tissues with different jobs. And that's kind of one of the real kind of key features of the animal kingdom, is the fact that animals have different tissues that make up different organs, and these organs contain or make up different systems, and these systems are very highly specialized to execute really sort of the jobs or the labor, if you will, of supporting the entire animal, okay? The highest rate of speciation in animals occurred during the Cambrian explosion about 550 million years ago. So it went from a time where basically there was, not a whole lot of life on our planet in terms of multicellularity. Prokaryotes were very abundant. Simplistic protists that were eukaryotic existed. And then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, in about 550 million years ago, I can tell you what the reason is in a second, but about 550 million years ago, there's this like big time explosion. So that's my version of an explosion, right? Where all of a sudden we have all kinds of animals appearing within the fossil record during this 40 million year period. And primarily what kind of caused this to be, what ultimately put it in place was the fact that our planet became had a high enough concentration of oxygen. Um, so plants and I'm sorry, the process of photosynthesis and the oxygenation of our atmosphere leads to a period of time where then larger bodied organisms can actually evolve, and lots of them do, because the larger the body in the animal kingdom, usually the more, or sorry, I should say, the less efficient it is. So the reality is that that sort of tipping point, the oxygenation of our planet, the process of photosynthesis, the early evolution of algae and some of these pre-plant species that led to the oxygenation of our planet, really is a tipping point for animals to evolve. Okay, so pretty cool. As far as diversity goes, lots of different many phylum and classes of organisms, and it is, maybe it's a little bit more, I don't know, maybe more known, I think, because humans were part of the animal kingdom, so I think that we maybe have a tendency to maybe be a little more interested in them sometimes, so we maybe know a little bit more about the animal kingdom. But to each their own, right? I mean, there's people that are really into plants too, so I get it. But some key things, like, and we're going to look at this and talk maybe a little bit more from the human perspective. Humans belong to the phyla or phylum Chordata. Okay, so remember, kingdom, right? And then so kingdom, we're in the animal kingdom, and then phylum, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So kingdom, phylum, the phyla Chordata. Chordata refers to all chordates. Now, chordates is sort of a fancy term for, they have a structure called a notochord. A notochord is it's a concentration of nerve cells that ultimately may or end up developing into different aspects of either the backbone or spinal cord. Okay, so we have our spine; it houses our spinal cord. That is sort of an extension. It's a conglomeration of lots of nerve cells, and it's an extension of our central nervous system. And it plays a real pivotal role in communicating to the rest of our body parts from our brain. So we are part of the phyla Chordata, or the chordates, and there are many classes of chordates that we'll kind of take a look at in just a minute. Okay. And then humans belong to the class Mammalia, right? So kingdom, phylum, class, we belong to the mammals. And what makes mammals unique from other classes of animals would be the fact that mammals produce milk and they have body hair covering. Okay. All right. So just to kind of give you a perspective, so here's all these different groups within the animal kingdom, ranging all the way from, sponges to the cnidarians and the cnidophores, which are things like jellyfish, the flatworms and ribbon worms, moving our way up through the rotifers and the mollusks and clams and annelids and arthropods. These are arthropods also including insects as part of that section, the echinoderms, and then chordates. So here's chordates, and we are a member of that. And some of the things that we look at on this little tree here, and again, if we had more time and we were, you guys took a course in zoology or something where you take a little bit deeper look into the animal kingdom, there's some key kind of dividing points that build us towards sort of the maybe a little bit more complexity, and again, not necessarily more successful, but a little bit more complexity in terms of body plans that we see on the right hand side of this tree here. And some of these we're going to talk about. So this idea of multicellularity is obviously a big deal. Dividing into tissue and germ layers. So layering of these tissues and developing tissues that become organs and systems and all that good stuff. Tube within a tube, so body cavities. We're going to learn about that in a little bit. Segmentation. This is a big deal. Like the fact that we have segments of, segmentation is really apparent, like when you look at arthropods and insects, right? You have lots of these sort of segments, and each segment has sort of their own little job. Now, obviously, as chordates, we're a little less segmented, but the idea is still there. We have a head, and then we have a body or an abdomen, or a thoracic region and abdomen. We have legs. There's different sections of our bodies that have undergone segmentization that allow for different jobs to be able to be overtaken or taken up. And it's basically division of labor, right? And all for the collective of being able to help support the organism. It's for the reason of, from an evolutionary perspective, if there's injury that happens to, if I cut off a couple on, if I'm in an accident, I lose a couple of my fingers, it doesn't mean that I lose my life, right? It means that, that part of my system is affected, but it doesn't mean the demise of the entire organism. But, when you're, sort of on the lower end of this scale, you have lots of cells that are responsible for lots of jobs. So that's that idea of segmentation that we'll look at. And then these are the chordates that we talked about, of which mammals are a type of chordate. Some of these you're maybe, a little less familiar with, but like ascidians and salps and these types of things down here. But then you move into the lampreys, cartilaginous fish like sharks, rayfin fish, lobefin fish. They're kind of an interesting story. They're sort of a intermediate between bony fishes or rayfin fishes and amphibians. There are some that exist today that are essentially thought of as living fossils. They were thought to have gone extinct, but they found some samples of these organisms that still survive. Amphibians like frogs and toads, reptiles like snakes and alligators and things like that, birds, and then mammals. Okay, and we're part of the mammalian grouping. Okay. Now, so one of the things that we look at and described in the animal kingdom is symmetry. So there's three types of patterns. There's radial, bilateral, and asymmetry or asymmetrical. So radial symmetry, the body parts are arranged around a central axis, and really think of it as kind of mirror images or mirror planes. In radial symmetry, there's basically kind of an infinite amount. Okay, so when we think of radial symmetry, so here's what is this called now? I'm blanking right now. It's not a jellyfish, but I'm blanking right now on what it's called. But radial symmetry it revolves around, so there's one sort of central axis, and we can, a multitude of these mirror images or mirror planes that we could divide it in half, rotating around that central axis. So this is considered radial symmetry. You could think of like, think of a basketball too. A basketball has radial symmetry too. You can divide it on more or less sort of an infinite number of ways along these sort of different mirror planes that you would have equal halves. Okay, so that's radial symmetry. Bilateral symmetry, body exhibits a left and a right side, in other mirror images. So a lobster would be an example, right? So a lobster or crayfish or whatever would be an example showing bilateral symmetry. Humans, we are bilaterally symmetric, right? I know that's not a very good picture, but you guys get the idea. We have a right and a left side, right, that represent sort of mirror images to one another. Okay. And then finally, the third and final one is that of asymmetry. And asymmetry really is the lack of symmetry, meaning it does not any sort of no symmetrical pattern. There's no mirror plane along which you could divide it, in which both sides are equal or mirror images of one another. So, things like sponges and some of these other aquatic organisms will exhibit asymmetry. So here's a sponge with asymmetry. There's no way to sort of divide this in half that would show equal sides on either side of that mirror plane. Okay, so symmetry is one way that we describe the animal kingdom and look at classifying the animal kingdom. And you also see that, as you kind of move towards some of these higher orders of symmetry, you see a little bit more complexity, and you see a little bit more of this segmentation, and you see a little bit more of this sort of division of labor among these different segments or body segments within the body plan of that organism. Okay. All right. Because it was bothering me. I couldn't remember what this was called. and it's a sea anemone. And we'll look at kind of the idea of what this has with the gastric cavity later on. So it's a sea anemone, right? So these kind of interesting looking sort of sea creature that shows radial symmetry. Okay. All right. So moving onwards, next way that we look at how we look at classifying or describing the animal kingdom is according to their how they support their bodies. Okay. So the skeleton is a feature that is unique to that of the animal kingdom. Now, there's a few different types of skeletons that are featured within the animal kingdom. There's exoskeletons that are found on the outside of the body. So those are insects and crustaceans and snails will have this exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. Chitin is a protein made like our hair and fingernails made of chitin. But if you ever step on an insect where that sort of crunchiness of an insect is because of that chitin that makes up their exoskeleton. An endoskeleton is one that's found inside the body. So we have an endoskeleton. So exo, that prefix means outside. Endo means inside. So endoskeletons are found inside, right? So sea stars, sharks, horses, humans are made up of some sort of a skeleton that's on the internal. Some are made of cartilage, some are made of cartilage and bone. Obviously, like think of sharks and things like that. Sharks, skates, and rays. They are cartilaginous fishes, so their skeletons can be completely made up of cartilage, whereas like humans or horses, things like that, are going to be made up of bone and cartilage. Okay, where the cartilage is on connection points within joints. Then the third one, which is kind of not always thought about, but these are called hydrostatic skeletons. These are pretty cool. They really lack a skeleton, but they use what's called hydrostatic pressure, right? They use water pressure to hold their body form. So octopus and earthworms will use this. They will literally, like, it's almost like, think about like pumping air into a tire or pumping water into a water balloon. If you don't have air in the tire of your bike, or you don't have air in the tire of your car, or you don't have water or air inside of a balloon, right? It's kind of sort of floppy. It's not really gonna have any form. But in the hydrostatic skeleton, they really sort of, in a sense, puff up their bodies by using water pressure on these internal cavities to hold their form. So octopus and earthworms will show this hydrostatic skeleton. It's like think of a water balloon almost, right? That provides some internal pressure to support their body. Okay. All right. So just visual. So endoskeleton inside, right? Exoskeleton, shell on the outside of a snail, and then hydrostatic skeleton, the water pressure that's built up inside an earthworm's cavity to be able to give it some form. Okay. All right. Moving forward. The humans were part of the chordates, right? And then the chordates can be further subdivided into either sorry, I said that wrong. In the animal kingdom, we can divide it among either invertebrates or vertebrates. Okay. And how do we look at that? It's through the presence or absence of a backbone. A backbone is a bony structure that surrounds the spinal cord. Okay. So vertebrates have a backbone, right? They can live in aquatic and terrestrial environments, things like fishes and snakes and dogs and humans, etc., right? Cats and blah. These are all vertebrate animals. They have a backbone, and that backbone is responsible for housing the spinal cord and offering some structural to support to the organism, right? I think of our spine. Our spine is hugely responsible for supporting our body and allowing us to stand up and stay upright and all those good things. And then we have invertebrates. Invertebrates, they have some sort of nervous system. They're going to be chordates. They're going to have some sort of a nervous tissue communication system, but they lack any sort of backbone. So many will still have a spinal cord. Not all of them will not. So we got to understand that not some of them will have a spinal cord. Some of these chordates that we've talked about fall in the category of still being invertebrates. They have a spinal cord or they have some sort of a notochord, but they aren't necessarily, they don't have a backbone that surrounds it. But roughly about 95% of all animal species would fall in the category of invertebrates. So when you talk about the animal kingdom, the vast majority of animals within the animal kingdom would fall in this invertebrate category. So we're talking snails, insects, worms, you know, clams, oysters, whatever, you know, any sort of those that fall in the class of invertebrate. Okay. So if we'll go back to this, just to kind of give you an idea. So really, it's really everything here. You know, these are all sort of invertebrates. Okay. All right. Bum, 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 bum. And again, vertebrae versus spinal cord. Remember, spinal cord is just, it's a conglomeration or a collection of nerve cells that stretches, you know, from, in our case, you know, from the base of our skull or our brain through to the top of our pelvis. And the vertebrae are there to house, right? There's an opening inside the vertebrae that the spinal cord travels through. Okay. Another way that we look at kind of dividing among animals is how do they regulate temperature? There is, you know, the classic warm-blooded versus cold-blooded. Although I don't like those terms, and no scientist really does, because it's a little bit it's deceptive. You know, cold-blooded doesn't mean that their blood is always cold. It just means that the terms that we use would be endotherms and ectotherms. Okay, so there's two different methods of regulating body temperature. Endotherms are those that use their own metabolism to regulate body temperature. And when we say metabolism is kind of this fancy term in science for all of the reactions that help support a living organism to survive. One of the byproducts of a lot of the things that our bodies have to do is they will give off heat. So these different chemical reactions that support our bodies give off heat. And that heat then helps to keep our bodies warm and temperatures stable. So, you know, our body temperature is about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. It stays pretty stable, you know, throughout conditions. Yeah, and we have to re-regulate our body temperature by either, you know, shivering or putting more warm clothes on or sweating if it's really hot. But our body temperature stays pretty darn consistent. Okay. So birds and mammals, right? These are considered endotherms. Remember, endo means inside. Okay. Ectotherms, ecto means sort of outside. Ectotherms, so this would be, endotherms would be considered the kind of the classic warm-blooded, right? Ectotherms would be considered the classic cold-blooded. And again, I don't like really that term, but just to give you guys that understanding. Ectotherms use their surrounding environment to regulate their body temperature. So in other words, they're dependent upon their surrounding environment to regulate their body temperature. So things like reptiles, okay? So snakes and things like that, salamanders, crocodiles or the crocodilians, either alligators or crocodiles. Their body temperatures tend to fluctuate, and they fluctuate because of their surrounding environment has temperature fluctuations. So ectotherms are reliant upon their surrounding environment to provide them heat to help regulate their body reactions, which is part of the reason why, like, when it's really cold, like things like lizards and crocodiles and alligators and snakes, they're not very active when it's cold out. Why? Because it affects their metabolic capabilities. They need heat to be able to run the chemical reactions that support their bodies. So often you'll see ectotherms, cold-blooded animals, they'll be out sunning themselves. They are literally trying to soak up heat and radiation from either the surfaces that they're on or from the sun that they're in to be able to increase their body temperature so they can then become more active, okay? This is why you don't see, you know, snakes in the wintertime up here, right? Because they are in hibernation. They are not able to move and be active when it's really cold out, okay? Whereas endotherms, they can regulate their own body temperature using their internal heat. So It's just another look here. So a bobcat is an endotherm. Its body temperature stays pretty consistent. So ambient temperature refers to air temperature. So whether it's really cold or whether it's really warm, doesn't really matter. The bobcat's going to have pretty stable body temperatures. But the snake that's an ectotherm, its body temperature will basically mirror image that of the air temperature around it. So, oh, did you want to say hi real quick?
Hi.
Right. So, ecto versus endotherms. Okay. All right. Wait for the sound to come back. I just pause for a second. So we just got done talking ecto versus endotherms. Now let's move into sort of modes of respiration. So respiration is again, the need for oxygen to execute cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is executed by these organisms. They're heterotrophic. And there's kind of three methods in which we see in the animal kingdom. Diffusion, the use of gills, and then the use of lungs. Okay, so diffusion is it's animals that have a simple body plan. Well, they don't have any blood, and then a lot of times these are ones that are going to be obviously existing in aquatic environments. In other words, they're in water and they can absorb dissolved oxygen within the water and diffuse CO2 back out of themselves in the water that they're in. So jellyfish are an example that simple body plans, and they diffuse O2 and CO2 across their membranes. Don't have any sort of structure or lung that has any responsibility for absorbing oxygen. Okay. And then gills. Gills are when they are responsible for removing diffused oxygen from water and transferring it into the blood. In a way, I always kind of think of it this way. Think of like gills almost like inside out lungs in a sense. Okay. They are going to be responsible for gas exchange of O2 and CO2, and almost like, and fish have gills, right? They're almost like their lungs are like kind of inside out and opened up and on the side of their head almost, okay? And then lungs, these are internal, and they're responsible for removing O2 and transferring CO2 back out to the atmosphere. But these are internal, right? Okay. So lungs versus gills, just to kind of give you guys an image of what I just said. So typically in fish, there's also the fact that they have kind of, it's what's called like a heart that's in line. Like our heart, in the case of like an amphibian or even us being mammals, it's going to be very similar to this. We have chambered hearts that will take in deoxygenated blood, pump it to our lungs, and then we'll return that oxygenated blood to be traveled throughout our bodies. Whereas fish, it's a little different. They have their gills, right, that are these capillary beds that are responsible for gas exchange in and out. And then they move blood into the gill capillaries, and then that blood comes directly out of the gill capillaries, doesn't return to the heart, and then it goes to the rest of the tissues of the fish to be able to exchange oxygen to the working cells. So a little different idea, but these gills are, like I said, somewhat analogous to the idea of lungs. Okay, but again, these gills are, they're an external feature, there's like gill covers and things like that. They're not completely external in some cases, or in cases of fish, but they play that same role. Okay, digestion is another kind of key feature that we see within the animal kingdom. Digestion is the breaking down of macromolecules into monomers for the body to use. The foods that we consume, they have to be broken down within our digestive system to be able to be used by our cells. So some invertebrates have a gastrovascular cavity where digestion takes place outside of the body. Okay. So just to kind of give you an idea of gastrovascular cavity, it has a single opening. So here's that sea anemone from before, and water and whatever food particles and materials that they're pulling into its cavity are going to be digested, and then whatever's not used gets ejected right back out that single opening. There's no mouth and then anus. There's no two ends to the tube. There's not a tube that moves throughout their body. There's one opening, one closure. Okay. Some invertebrates, though, and all vertebrates have a complete digestive tract. So what's a GI stands for gastrointestinal tract. It's a tube that connects the mouth to the anus. So in other words, there are different regions that have specialized jobs. So like our stomach digests proteins, and then there's different portions of our digestive system that are responsible for different things. Okay. So our digestive tract in humans is this tube that moves from mouth to anus and is going to be responsible for breaking apart all the foods that we consume. Okay. All right. So the digestive tract, a complete digestive tract, and again, it's all about division of jobs, right? It's to make it so one part isn't responsible for everything, and we see that over and over again within the animal kingdom, which is really pretty cool when you start to think about it, right? It leads to ultimately the success of the organism. It also leads to the fact that if something goes wrong with one part of these different segmented jobs or these different divisions of jobs, it doesn't mean the demise of the organism. Okay? And then last couple things here is modes of reproduction. Most animals reproduce sexually, right? So sexual reproduction and resulting in genetic variation and shuffling of the deck. So that is the vast majority of them. A few can reproduce asexually, which is certainly an advantage, meaning that even if sexual reproduction isn't an option at certain points, then asexual reproduction does happen. So like some sponges will go through budding, but for the most part, like I said, sexual reproduction is the key way that we see in the animal kingdom. Now, there's two types. There's external fertilization and internal fertilization, right? So like external fertilization, sperm and egg fuse outside the body. So like fishes, amphibians, like frogs, okay? And then internal fertilization, where sperm and egg fuse inside the body in the case of mammals. Now, the one thing I want, so external fertilization, so here's the amphibian life cycle, so lots of eggs. Those eggs develop outside the body, and then they develop into tadpoles, and those develop into adult frogs. So as far as external fertilization, there's less of sort of an investment in terms of having to rear the young and take care of the young. So the consequence is that, when you think about fishes and amphibians and external fertilization, they lay lots of eggs, right? They fertilize and lay lots of eggs, right? Why? For the purpose of that, the hope is, because, these parents aren't hanging out here. Once they're done and this egg packet is hanging out there, they're gone, right? It's a survival technique. The hope is that some of them actually do survive and then create the life cycle again, okay? So external fertilization, in order to ensure that some survive, they have to lay and have lots of eggs. Now, internal fertilization, like such as in the case of mammals, right? In internal fertilization, the embryo develops within the uterus and ultimately is protected, right? Humans are pregnant for about 9 months, and then give birth, and there's usually sort of a heavy investment within in internal fertilization, where you have less young, right? Okay. But these less young are going to have sort of a greater chance of survival because they developed internally, right? During that incubation phase or during that particular range of time, they are protected. They're more protected, okay? So internal fertilization versus external fertilization, okay? All right, guys. That wraps it up. Like I said, going back to this, it's okay if you kind of divide this up into a couple of days. Don't worry about, if you can watch this over a couple of days. Tomorrow, Wednesday, is the quiz on plants, and worry more about that. But this is the animal lecture, and thank you very much. And as always, if you guys ever have any questions, you know where to find me. send messages, ask questions. We're good to go. Thanks, guys.